tried to correct the situation a little by through my daughter. My daughter has grown up both speaking English and speaking Spanish. So the right thing I suppose would have been to invite her down here, and then she could have translated for those of you who are listening in Spanish. And I apologize also because I'm known to kill translators. When I start talking, I tend to get going pretty quickly. Where's the clicker? The who? Yeah. First, let me start by saying I truly do invite you to come back and join the panel. I have some questions, and I'm sure the rest of you have questions, and I'm looking forward to a happy interchange of thoughts there. I'm going to echo and flesh out some of the things that Ellen said, perhaps in my own way, and try to give you some perspectives on what I think is going on in the world. But first, let me start with a little bit of homework, okay? Not exactly homework, but a little bit of preparation, or the ways to think about things, and ways in particular that I think about things. One of those is this concept of threshold events. And I think it's an important thing because I think we're at the threshold of a new era now in our communications. And a threshold is the kind of thing that when you cross it, there is no turning back. It's a paradigm shift. It's when the world suddenly becomes different. Now, you can think about threshold events that you've seen in the past, and the challenge is to try to think of the ones that are coming, because when you cross that river, when you cross through that door onto the other side, or cross that threshold, things are different, and you can never turn back. Let me give you my example. One of my favorite examples is reading on a screen. Okay? For 35 years, we worked on electronic media. And in the 1970s, we, at the predecessor of the Media Laboratory, we literally put books on TVs. We did all the work to make the fonts that look as good as the text that you're looking at today. We even did the animation of the page flipping that you can occasionally see. And in those days, people already, always said, nobody's going to read a book on a screen because it's like staring at a 100-watt light bulb. And indeed, that's what these kinds of screens are. They're like a 100-watt light bulb. So in the 1990s, Joe Jacobson came to the Media Laboratory. And Joe had an idea. And his idea was to take ink and make ink that once you put it on a page could be changed. And his vision was of a bookshelf of tomorrow where you would have one book. And you would pull that book off your shelf, and when you put it in your hand, it was the book you wanted. And every page would reflect and change to print the book that you wanted. Well, that became electronic ink, and that became the Kindle, and that became the way people read now. And that's a threshold event. Because books, as printed material, they're over. Now, you may like your book, and you may like your newspaper, and I'm not going to take it away from you. You're welcome to have it, you're welcome to read it, and you're welcome to use it. You don't have to use electronic ink. But the problem is, you're going to die. And you know what's going to happen? Your daughter is going to walk in and see this kitchen table piled with all of these books and say, my God, why didn't Mom just leave me a thumb drive? So that's a threshold event, reading on a screen. Once we started to read on a screen, the world changed and it never went back. I think keyboards are a threshold event. Keyboards change the way we live. The threshold event here is, when did a keyboard become acceptable in this case, an American living room? And the answer is probably about 3 years ago. 3 years ago, I looked into the numbers, and 800,000 television sets in the United States were sold that had an internet connection. And that implies a keyboard, okay? So nobody measured keyboards, but they measured TV sets with internet connection. The following year, 2.7 million TV sets were sold, and after that, 4 million TV sets were sold with internet connections. So a keyboard in the American living room. Alan thinks it's the beginning of the end of broadcasting. I'm not sure. I agree. I think broadcasting has legs. It's been around since Euripides, and it may change, and its economics may certainly change. But when you put a keyboard in a living room, suddenly your interface to information is not a selection device, but it's an exploration device, because you can express anything with a keyboard. And that's a threshold event. Most of you are not old enough to remember, but there was a period of time when you could not have a keyboard in an executive office. It was a loss of status to have a keyboard in an executive office. Executives leaned on the desk and dictated letters to their secretaries. I think they still do that in Germany. I think they don't write their own email. So a threshold event is when that keyboard moves into an office. So there's others you could think of. The nationwide credit card. There was a time when credit cards were cards issued by individual stores. But the transformation of transactions by giving people a universal card, I think, was important. SSL, secure sockets on the internet. When the web first started to become popular in the mid-1990s, it was nothing more than advertising. It was nothing more than bookmarks. But the ability to do secure communications on the web, SSL, was a threshold event that changed our life. So you can list your own. The challenge before you, and the reason I give you this as sort of like phase one of what I want to talk about, is to think about what the threshold event is. I think, and I suspect BlackBerry thinks as well, that if you look ahead 3 years, all around the world, there are going to be 5 billion devices about as smart as the device that you have today, and the device that BlackBerry is going to provide you tomorrow. 5 billion of those, 5 billion people walk. There are already more mobile devices than there are people. In 3 years, there'll be on the order of twice as many mobile devices as there are people. But those mobile devices will suddenly become computers. They won't be phones. They won't be feature phones. That's a threshold device. That has implications, as you've heard, for the way we live, the way we communicate, what we do with the air fields around us, and what we do with the spaces. I'll return to that. So that may be the key threshold event for you to think about today. The other thing that I want to kind of seed you with, that I'd like to prepare you with before I tell you what I'm really going to tell you, okay, is just sort of my own theory of what the rates of change are in the world. See, everybody thinks that it's all because of technology, that we invent technologies so rapidly that our heads spin, and those technologies cause life around us to change. I'm not sure that it is the technology. I think technology unlocks the door, but I think it's society that is the true agent of those changes. But more important, I believe that the rate of change of society is a function, is dependent on the age at which you are introduced to the dominant technology of the time. Okay? So the rate of change of society depends on the age that you're introduced to the dominant technology. Now, think about that. 50 years ago, the dominant technology was the automobile. Now, in most of the United States, with the exception of Florida, you kind of have to be 16 to drive. And so the flywheel of society, the clock speed of society is roughly 16 years, right? So you invent the car, and 16 years later you start to invent roadside motels, and 32 years later we start to invent malls, and we start to invent drive-in movies and suburbs, and 48 years later we invent more suburbs and drive-bys, and suddenly the world is changing, but it's changing at a rate of 16 years. The dominant technology today is communications and computing and mobility. Now you're introduced to that technology at the age of 4. So every 4 years, there's fundamentally a new generation of people being born with new technologies at their disposal. Alan Kay once said that technology is anything invented after you were born. So think about that. The automobile is not technology to you, but these PCs are. They were invented after you were born. These are not technologies to the children of tomorrow. I went to high school in the 1960s. My sister went to the same high school that I did 3 years later than I did. Now, her experience of high school was fundamentally the same as mine. But think of your kids. Think of one of them going through high school now, and another one going through high school 3 years ago, and 3 years before that. Their experience of high school is completely different. One of them went through with Twitter, one of them went through with texting and SMS, one went through with pagers, one went through with cell phones, one went through with none. So the rate of change of society is not a function of the technology, it's a function of the generational change in society, and that generational change is happening much more quickly now. I've spoken to many companies. I know how companies design their products. They get a bunch of 40-year-old guys sitting around in a room, there's always guys, and the topic of conversation is, did you see what my daughter did on Facebook last night? I call that RFD design, reasoning from daughter. And like me today, the only mistake we probably make is not hiring those kids and not bringing them in, because they indeed are the designers and not us. Okay, so that's the homework. Think about the notion of these threshold events, and think about that notion of how and what the sources and seeds of change are, because they're generational, they're not. Now, that's sort of the introduction. So what I really want to talk about is shown on this slide. And that is, I believe we are on the threshold of a new era, and that new era is as important as the first era of being digital was 10 years ago. Now, let me explain to you that I'm from the Media Laboratory, and you may not know what that is, but we really had a bunch of research groups at MIT in the 1970s, and in the mid-1980s, we took all those groups and we put them together in a new building, and we called it the MediaLab. And what we did, we were not the only people who did it, but we were the only people who did it with that insane fervor that resulted in some inventions being made. What we did was we digitized everything. We digitized sound, we digitized music, we digitized speech, we digitized pictures, we digitized movies, we dealt with graphics, and we transformed the world, not the only one, but we concentrated on transforming the world from an analog world into a world where all of our media was digital. Now, in those days, nobody really understood what that meant. And nobody really understood what it would mean. And so, as a result, we could do anything we wanted, because nobody was crazy enough to invest so much money and such a resource into tremendous computing and displays and loudspeakers and microphones just in order to play games with what it would be like in a world of digital media. We did lots of bad ideas, we did lots of good ideas. Maybe reading on a screen was one of the better ideas that we did, and a lot of them were pretty stupid, but it was so new and so ill understood, so incompletely understood, that no matter what you did, you always learned something. People think of research as being high risk. I don't think of research as being high risk, because no matter what the outcome, we always learn something from that research. Well, that digital revolution sort of ended in the 1990s, and you're living with it now, and you know what it's like. You know what it's like to live in that world of digital media, and it certainly was a change. That was a threshold event. I believe today we're at the threshold of an era that is as important as that era was 10 or 15 years ago. And it is this era of digital understanding. And I believe that it's important because of what's happening is the instant, not even rapid, but instant maturity of 4 very distinct things. And I'll give you my list of the 4. They're on the slide here. Now, you can think of your own. Maybe there's 5. Maybe mine aren't perfect. But these are the 4 that I think of. And what's astonishing about them is now how they have suddenly matured all at once and all together. And if you look at them all together, then you can see that there is some sort of threshold through which we're crossing, and life won't be the same afterwards. Now, the first of these is analytics, okay? And we think of analytics as big data. That's the popular word for analytics, okay? But it's important to understand what big data is. Big data is not lots of data, okay? Lots of data is different from big data. In the United States, the supermarket has been collecting information about me since 1995. That's lots of data. That's not big data. What big data is data that is high resolution, of the granularity and resolution that we've not seen before. It's data that's big in scope, not just scale. It crosses boundaries that has never been crossed in data before. The supermarket never correlated its data with my medical records, and never correlated it with my driving patterns, and never correlated it with how many miles I walk in the morning, and what the size of my family is, and what the geographic region is, and what sorts of epidemics have been going. Those were data silos. Those were lots of data hidden away in their own locker. Big data is data across scope. It's the ability to take a look at all of that data and paint a new picture. Most important, that data is real time. It's collected autonomously. It's not collected by you contributing it. It's collected automatically in the course of your daily work. It's collected in real time, and it's collected everywhere. And perhaps most important, it's wedded to advanced representations that allow us to interpret it in new ways. That's what big data is. And big data is important, and it's part of that digital understanding revolution. But think about it. Did you talk about big data 2 years ago? Was that on the tip of everyone's tongue? Okay, maybe some of you did. But it's the suddenness with which that data has suddenly matured and become available that's what's changing the world. Let me just give you some examples. Cesar Hidalgo came to MIT, and Cesar is demonstrating in what I'm going to show you the resolution associated with some of that big data. Now, when you think of international trade, which Cesar spent a lot of time thinking about, usually the productivity of a country is measured by 2 numbers, okay? It's measured by the multiplication or the product of the value of the products they export times the amount of those products. And if you multiply those 2 numbers, you get some sense, in a very gross way, of a country's position or standing in the world or its potential for growth. Well, Cesar took a look and decided to look at that much more closely. So Cesar looked at the exports of countries, and he divided those exports up into the 440 universally recognized product categories, okay? So he looked not just at the value of things that countries exported, but he looked at the specifics of what each one of those things that those countries manufactured and exported was. And he created a map. And that map is the product space. Because in his analysis of those exports, he took a measure and tried to understand what the likelihood of exporting something else was if you exported one thing. So if you exported mangoes, then a country was more likely to export bananas and less likely to export ore or fish or furniture or farm materials. And if you exported farm materials, then you were more likely to export machinery, and if you exported machinery, you were more likely to export things like electronics. So his product map shows you how many of these products that countries trade in are associated and linked and coupled to other products. So if you look at the map at the very top, there's oil. The size of the circle, that orange circle up there, is rather large. Countries that export oil export a lot of value in oil, but they tend not to export anything else. When you get towards the center of the diagram, countries that export garments also export fabrics. They export different kinds of garments. They might export shoes. So the correlation or connection between those products is kind of high. And then you get into textiles, and when you get into the center, you get into finished machinery, automobiles, electronics, consumer goods, and things like that. And countries that export those tend to export other things in the like area, and they're tightly connected and in a web. Now, why would that be important? Well, it's important if you want to see what the potential a country has for growth. Now, if you look at two countries, almost 30 years ago, Korea and Peru, just to give you examples, here's that same product map shown at the top of the slide. And there's Peru, and in 1975, I'm not sure you can read this, and that's okay because you can always go to MIT and play with this data yourself. In any case, Peru's exports concentrated in unrefined copper, ores, mining, zinc, materials like that. Those are the brown areas, and those are the areas shown by squares where Peru exports raw sugar, beets, and cane. That's 1975. That's Peru. Now look at Korea in the same area. Korea was exporting fabrics. Korea was exporting plywood. That blue stuff down there is electronics, and that's in the center of connectedness in product space. But Korea, like Peru, in 1975 was somewhat peripheral. So what's their prospects? Well, let's look at them a few years later. There we go. Okay, so in 2009, now let's look at the difference in the mix of products. The blue suddenly got big, cars, electronics, and Korea migrated to the center of the product space. Do you think that that's an area of fast growth? How about Peru? How about Peru? Hear it for Peru. I could have put Chile up there. Cesar's from Chile. It's 30 years later. It's 30 years later, where is Peru? Peru's grown a little bit down there, knitted garments and things like that, but it's still dominated by gold. Chile's dominated by silver, fish, and things like that. It's still dominated by things that are at the periphery. So if you want to grow, you look at the data, you look at the representation, you look at the connectedness, and you see which things you want to develop in your economy. That's big data. That's looking at data in resolution and with representations that you've not seen before. I made this slide yesterday with another system that we're testing. Cesar is testing in the laboratory. This is a map of my email. This is a map of 30,000 emails that I've sent and received over the course of the last 3 years. Pardon? No. Well, it doesn't say that I read the emails. It only said that you may also be assuming that I wrote the emails that I send, but probably like most of you, I just forward the other ones that I get without reading them. Oddly enough, I hadn't looked at this chart until a couple of days ago, and so my assistant is the big blue dot. There seems to be a lot more email between me and my assistant than me and my wife, who's number 4, okay? But so suddenly, this is real time. If you use this as a program, then you can click on any one of those and you can see that my phone system is broken. There's my wife over there, and we're probably going to have dinner sometime in the next few days. But that's big data, and that's the representations associated with it. Now, one of our recent graduates, Ben Weber, who's formed a company called Sociometric Solutions, Ben's taken this notion of data across scope a little bit farther. Now, everybody knows there are companies where we plot the email traffic between people. And we use that email traffic as a sort of representation. or a proxy for who in the organization communicates with who else in the organization. Well, Ben took that one step further, and what he built was a little badge. Now, lots and lots of companies have badges, so it isn't such a bad thing to make an electronic version of the badge. And what the badge does is it has a microphone, and it has Bluetooth, and it has another sensor, and it can tell when you're near or facing or talking to somebody. So what Ben did was he correlated the email traffic that flows in a corporation with the face-to-face discussions that flow in a corporation and the telephone calls that flow in a corporation. So suddenly it's big data, not just lots of data, because it's taking all of those variables and analyzing them at once. Now, they tried this for a while in a bank in Czechoslovakia. And they looked at 3 branches in the bank over the course of about a month. And people were wearing Ben's badges, and he was plotting who spoke to each other, and he was plotting what email traffic went between each other. And that's a look at the connectedness, the number of times those people talk to each other somehow over the course of a month. Branch 1, branch 2, and branch 3. Now, just as a quick quiz or example, which one of those branches do you think was the most productive? Okay, which was the best performing branch in that Czech bank? Any guesses? How many think branch 1? Don't be afraid, there's no one here from Czechoslovakia. Okay, so we got some votes for branch. How many people think that branch 2 was the most productive bank? Looks like lots of connections there. We had some votes for branch 2. How many think that branch 3 was the... Okay, well, people pretty evenly divided. It's kind of like an American election. All right, there's the answer of this month. Okay, branch 1 was the one that was the most productive. Now, what are the characteristics of branch 2 and branch 3 that made them less productive? Well, branch 2, if you take a look at this, that was a 2-story building. So there's a collection of people that talk to each other on the first floor, and there's a collection of people that talk to each other on the second floor, but the people on the second floor and the first floor don't talk to each other. And that undermined their ability to be productive. What's the solution for that? Rent out the second floor to someone else. Put those people on the same floor. Or put a cafeteria down there. Get those people to work together. What's the characteristic of branch 3? Branch 3 had a very tightly connected group of people that spent a lot of time talking together and working together. Those of you who voted for branch 3 should pat yourself on the back. They were a highly productive gang of people. But what about these people at the edge? What's that?
Bosses.
Almost. Those people at the edge were the new hired people. And the new hired people had trouble breaking into the network. They were hired, they went to their office, but these people were so tightly connected that they didn't talk to any of the newcomers. And so the newcomers undermined that bank's ability to be productive. So that's the notion of big data. That's a little bit of a taste of what big data is like. It's not just about tracking diseases, it certainly is at least that. It's not just about understanding health, it's certainly at least that. I have a friend in California, Larry Smar, who has dedicated his life to becoming a science experiment. He has his blood analyzed every month. He takes a picture of everything that he eats, and he analyzes all of the food. He wears a wristband and a chest band that reports on his activity, and he can tell how many calories he's using up in life, how many calories he's absorbing in life, what chemicals are in his blood. He's recently started to analyze all of the bacteria and parasites that are associated with our body. There are 10 times as much DNA in the bacteria in our body as there is in our body, which means that you are only 1/10 you, and the rest of you are parasites. And that bacteria exists in our mouth, it exists in our intestines, it exists under our arms, it exists all over us, and it's part of what makes us live. And he started to analyze that. He's also getting himself sliced with an MRI, and he runs a facility in California called Cal IT2, that has rooms where the entire room is a screen as big as all of these walls. So he has the ability to visualize that. And he's building a gigabit wide area network between the visualization facility and the mental facility so he can understand that. So big data is certainly about health. It's certainly about society. It's certainly about politics. But it's also about organizations. What it's really about is data that crosses boundaries, data that's real time, and data that's autonomous. And that emergence is relatively new. Now the second area of digital understanding that I think is important is the notion of understanding human psychology. And that's taking two forms. One of the forms is the rise in what we think of as behavioral economics. A dear friend Dan Ariely is a specialist in that. He wrote a wonderful book that I recommend that you all read called Predictably Irrational. And this book, has anybody read it? Oh, you really ought to read it. I mean, it's a wonderful book. You won't be able to put it down. Dan is an absolute master at devising experiments that expose what we all think of as human nature, but what economists have been ignoring as irrational behavior for our entire life. I suppose I should just tell you one quick example of this. There's a famous study that many people know that happened in a daycare center in Israel. And the problem in the daycare center was that all of the parents were coming to pick up their kids late. Okay? And so all the employees of the daycare center had to stay around after hours and babysit for the kids while their mothers or fathers would keep coming late and picking the kids up. So they decided they would fix this problem. And so they fixed it. And the fix that they did was they put in a fine. They charged you $20 if you arrived late. Makes sense, sounds reasonable. Avoid the fine, pick up your kid on time. Do you think it worked? No. Well, I wouldn't tell you the story if it worked. That would be no fun. It didn't work. Because suddenly the parents understood that there was a fee associated with being late. And they could make a decision and say, oh, it's worth $20, I'll be late. And they would just pay the fee. So they had replaced the social market of guilt with the financial market of money. And suddenly people took a look at it and said, it's a good deal, $20 and I can be late. Dan runs wonderful experiments like that. Invite me over for dinner, I give you a bottle of wine and you think it's wonderful. If I give you $20, that's an insult. Well, to an economist, the bottle of wine and $20 are the same. But to a person, they're not the same. So we're beginning to understand and codify human psychology through behavioral economics. That's recent, that's sudden. But a more important example, I think, for you here today is the example of using machines to understand people. Roz Picard has been working in the laboratory for 15 years, and what she works on is what she calls affective computing. Building computers that can understand how you feel. And so she has cameras that she can aim at your face and they can tell when you're smiling, and sensors on your skin, and so they can tell when you're nervous. But Roz is at the threshold of understanding the emotion that's behind that representation that we can detect. Okay? Because sometimes we smile because we're happy. Sometimes we smile because we're scared. Sometimes we smile because somebody just told us a joke. Sometimes we smile because somebody just tickled us. Roz can now understand the psychology that is behind, or beginning to understand the psychology or the emotion that is behind that representation. So building machines that understand our psychology, both as Dan does in considerations of when we become irrational, but also in understanding our emotions, is critically important. For years, Roz has spent a lot of time working with autistic children, because autistic children have trouble expressing and understanding emotions. And when do they learn, and how do we work with them, and when are we overwhelming them, and when are we making them more relaxed? These are the questions that Roz is beginning to understand. And that's new, and that's sudden. That understanding of human psychology is pretty rapid. So that's the first. The second. The first was big data. The second was the notion of of human psychology. Now the third, which is particularly important, especially to BlackBerry and QNX, and the cooperation between them, is the sudden emergence of sensing everywhere. For 15 years as well, in the laboratory, Joe Paradiso has worked on building sensor nets. And he's built inexpensive sensors that communicate with each other and report on the air pressure, the noise level, the quality of the air in a place. You might care about that if someone was going to build a runway at the airport and that runway had a danger of the planes flying over your house and changing your environment. Or if you're building a building, or if you're walking into a room. Joe spent lots of time building thermostats that people wear on their body so that when they walk into the room adjusts its temperature to the comfort of the people that are in it. Right now, thermostats are on the wall. Well, who cares if the wall is comfortable? Mostly you care if the people that are in the room are comfortable. So Joe spent 15 years building those kinds of sensors. That era is over. Sensing is now everywhere. And that sensing is everywhere because of the mobile devices that we start to carry, that are a repertoire, an ensemble of sensors. 5 years ago, if I walked in and said, I want to build a system that tells me when the bus is arriving, you would have said, Lippman, you're crazy. Do you want me to put a GPS on every bus and every taxi cab in the city of New York? That's ridiculous. 5 years ago, that was ridiculous. Now, it's commonplace. And we're looking at using those location technologies in order to decide whether you're inside a store and what aisle you're in a store and what product you're standing in front of that store. So the era of sensing is over. Ramesh Raskar in the Media Laboratory has built a $5 piece of plastic that you attach to the camera in a smartphone, hold it up and look into it with your eye, and it can tell you the prescription of eyeglasses that you need. Now imagine people all over the world for $5 not having to go to a doctor, but using the sensor in their phone to do that. Mike Bove had a student who just recently built a little chemical analyzer that attaches for maybe $20 worth of parts to the rest of your phone. You could dip that in the water. It'll tell you the difference between Coca-Cola and Diet Coke. It can tell you the difference between gin and vodka. Those things matter to some of us. But now imagine dipping that into the river and finding out if there's pollutants in the river. And doing that in the context of a social network and finding out what the likely pollutants up and downstream are. That's the problem with sensing. And the sensing problem has been solved. So we have big data. We have understanding human psychology. We have sensing that allows us to understand our environment. Those are things that have all matured within the last few years. And those are the parts or the legs of what I call digital understanding. Now, the fourth is one that I think is important, but you may disagree. And that is the notion of understanding places, understanding space. And when I say places, I mean real places and real things. Because, believe it or not, reality matters. I really doubt that the future is all of us orbiting the Earth in our own space bubble, communicating by HD TV screens. We're still going to walk down the streets of Santiago. We're still going to walk down the streets of Paris. We're still going to walk down the streets of Boston and New York and Miami, especially out here. And we're still going to interact with those places. And the design of those places has always been a reflection of technology. The design of cities, and remember, 50% of the people in the world today live in cities, and 90% of the growth in the foreseeable future is likely to be in cities. And those cities are based on the technologies, the economics, the sociology, the education, and the entertainment of the people that are in them. And we are now suddenly at the threshold of applying communications technology to the design of those spaces. Now, just to give you a sense of this, I always love putting up this slide. This is a slide of the office in 1929 of the chief executive officer of a shoe company in Austria. That shoe company, by the way, still exists. It's called Bata, and they're still making sneakers and shoes. Now, there's the office of the CEO. This is just a sense of space. Now, What's funny about this office? Well, I don't know if you look carefully, you can see that above the door to his office are these set of lights. Now, what are those sets of lights? Well, it turns out what he did was he built his office in an elevator in the corner of the factory. And those lights indicate the floor that he's on. So his office could move through the floors of the factory, and he could watch what all of the people were doing. Now, remember that Czech bank, where you had 2 floors where people didn't move up and downstairs? In 1929, the CEO of Bata Shoes used space to understand how his company worked in a new way. Well, we do a little bit of work on that. And that understanding of space is changing the way we think. That's a map of Paris with circles just illustrating what a 20-minute walk is in one of those places. And within that 20-minute walk in a marvelous, well-designed city like Paris, there's everything you need. So you have now a city as a network where each one of those nodes is somewhat self-sufficient with stores, coffee shops, markets, and the like, libraries. And a connected set of those is what's formed a city. So that's a networked city designed in the Napoleonic era. We do a lot of work on the technology of the transportation in those cities. And people in our Smart Cities program built an electric car. And it's an electric car that's designed to be a car not that you own, but a car that you borrow. It has motors in each of the wheels. We call them robotic wheels. So there's no central motor and there's no drive shaft. If you take the car and you pull it up to a parking space, you can turn all 4 of the wheels 90 degrees and go sideways into the parking space. But what's most interesting about the car is like a shopping cart. The car folds up and the front wheels get close to the back wheels. The door opens in the front. When the car folds up, the seat lifts up. It's kind of easy to get up and sit down, even if you're handicapped. And you can park these cars together like shopping carts. Of course, what makes the car yours, you have in your pocket. That's your mobile device. It's the dashboard. Take the car off the front of the rack, plop your device down there, and suddenly that's your car, and it's a new car. So there's a sort of schematic illustration of the 2 wheels close together and people getting up. But it's actually being built. It's being built in Spain right now. Now, if you think that's a little revolutionary for the way we run cities today, well, we also built a scooter. Scooter has the same principle. It's electric, folds up, goes into a rack. Put in your credit card, take out the scooter, drive it around the city, and when you're done, put it back. And we've done the same thing with bicycles. In this case, the motor and the batteries are completely contained in the rear wheel of a bicycle. You can put it on any bicycle. Now, if you outfit a city with those bicycles, then anyone can pick up the bicycle, drive it around, and it has a power assist. So as you step on the pedals, if you're riding along, the motor can help you ride a little faster. And that solves the problem that you have often with bicycles in a city, because when the bicycles are finished being used, they all tend to be at the bottom of the hill, because nobody wants to ride them uphill. So now the motor helps you ride them uphill. Of course, anyone who rides bikes in the city, that's no problem. You and I probably do ride our bikes uphill, but the idea of having bikes in the city is to encourage people who don't ride their bikes often. They'll ride up the hill. The cities that do it spend 50% of the cost of putting bicycles in the cities on trucks to drive the bicycles back up the hills and put them in the bike racks that are there so people can borrow them and drive down the hill again. So we solved that with a motor in the seat. Now that's the way the technology of the city is changing. So what are the 4 things that we have? We have big data, okay? We have suddenly understandings of data in fundamentally new and different ways. We have understanding human psychology. We have the problem of sensing solved. And we have the application of those technologies to the spaces around us. Now, what does that mean? Why do I call that a threshold, and where is that going to lead us? Well, let's just look, okay? 6 years ago, 7 years ago now, the Defense Department in the United States ran a contest. And the goal of the contest was to build an autonomous vehicle, a vehicle that had no driver. And the winner of that contest would be someone who could make that car drive 7 miles through the desert, I think in Arizona, successfully without hitting anything. 6 years ago, 6 miles. Google now has a fleet of autonomous vehicles that have over 300,000 miles on them with no driver, and they're licensed to be used on the road in Nevada, and I believe they're being discussed for licensing on the road in Florida. From 6 miles to 300,000 miles in 6 years. Now, how did we do that? Peter Norvig of Google was asked that question. And the answer in his mind was not a magical new algorithm, it was Street View. Google's cars can drive down the road because when they drive down the road, they've been there before. They've seen the road before. They can look at it as it actually exists. That's sensing. That's big data. That's an understanding of space. Not a lot of psychology in an autonomous vehicle, but that's an example of why this is a threshold. I did some work in Canada with a company, Nortel, a couple of years ago. And Nortel made a demonstration for a television show called Click that was an example of what high-speed mobile networks might mean for people. And they filmed it in Dallas, and they actually filmed a real emergency. Okay? Not a real emergency, it was a staged emergency. So it was the standard emergency that you would think of, okay? And the emergency is the husband collapses with a heart attack, the ambulance comes, and the ambulance starts driving him to the hospital. And while the ambulance is driving him to the hospital, the ambulance is beaming his vital signs back to the hospital, and the hospital is instructing the technicians in the ambulance what to do. It's using MapQuest to decide on the fastest route and where there's the least traffic and where to go. And of course, at the hospital, they're accessing the medical records and sending those back down to the ambulance. This was 3.5 years ago. Now, what's wrong with that picture? That's small data. I think the first thing that's wrong with that picture is if you showed that movie of an emergency response to the average audience in Britain, where the television program was aired, they probably would say to themselves, oh my God, you mean that's tomorrow? They don't do that already? Well, of course it is tomorrow, and they do it now. But the other thing that's wrong with that picture is that's not a digital understanding version. I have a slogan, a mantra, that I tell my students to say every day, okay, when they wake up. What I want them to say is, there is no me, there's only we. There is no me, there's only we. So every time they run across an application that somebody says is personalized, well, that's me. Transform that into something that's what you might think of as socialized and say that's about me. So let's take that ambulance. Why didn't that ambulance, while it was beaming those records around, send a message to his wife? Because his wife might be concerned if she hasn't heard from him. And in addition, she knows what he had for breakfast and whether he took his medications that morning. That's probably at least as important as his medical records. So that's big data, that's psychology, and that's communications changing the way that we live in the world. Deb Roy at the MediaLab tried an experiment for a year. He put into his house 13 television cameras in the ceiling with wide-angle lenses and 27 microphones, and he recorded everything that his newborn baby saw and heard. Petabytes of data. He recorded petabytes of data because he was interested in language acquisition. He was interested in what words his son heard. And so he recorded every word. In rural France, the first word that some kids hear is tractor. In many other countries, the first word they hear is mama. But that decides how we learn language. He used that same technology to explore another bank branch. And this is a trace of about a week of the traffic as analyzed by now 6 video cameras in a test bank branch in a program that we were running. And the yellow traces are where the customers walk, the red traces are where the people who are the employees of the bank walk, and suddenly, like Ben Weber, he has the ability to create insights into how people interact. That's the transformation of the world of big data and sensing and those kinds of things. He went on, took a leave from MIT, and applied some of that kind of same thinking to the notion of media, a company called Bluefin. So what you're looking at here is you're looking at a huge landscape that shows you every television program that's playing in America live that you can now fly over. But that's not what's important. That's not big data, that's lots of data. Because in addition to that, he's also overlaid on that what everyone is tweeting and saying on Facebook about each one of those programs. So suddenly you have the ability to correlate what people are watching, what's on the screen, with what people are saying about it. And that's a picture of Obama's State of the Union address about a year and a half ago, and that's the broadcast of the address, and that's the words that people are using as they listen to that address. Another couple of students went out and did exactly the same thing with music. They correlated what people were listening to with what they were saying about it. And suddenly they could uncover new forms of music that you wanted. That's the data, that's the psychology. So that's the threshold of where I think we are in this world of digital understanding. The joint and sudden, instant maturity of that world of data, that world of sensing, that world of psychology, and that world of understanding space. Now, what does that tell us? I'll just close for 2 minutes on where I think some of these things are going in the future. But I don't know. I fundamentally believe that it's an open area for experiment, just like what it was like 15 years ago, where we can do whatever we want and try whatever we want. Hardware is the new software. Kids in a weekend can do the same things with hardware and construction that 5 years ago they used to do by programming. When Sean Fanning spent a weekend in his living room and programmed Napster, you can now spend a weekend designing a new product or a new toy out of hardware. That's all new. In the world of mobility, I think what's happening now is that when 5 billion people all have these kinds of devices that are as good as the best devices that you have today, the very best devices will only get a little bit better. And the reason that they'll get only a little bit better is because the more powerful you make a device, the more power it uses. And we can't make a better battery, because if we make a better battery, it can become dangerous. And we don't know if the processing in those devices will use less power rapidly enough. So I think that what's likely to happen is the power of the devices that you carry will taper off. The ones that you have today will be less expensive, and so 5 billion people will now have devices that are substantially the same. That implies a new network. That implies that these devices now work in cooperation with their surroundings in ways that we didn't think of before. They're not just a phone call, they're not just a messaging device, but they are devices that we carry around, and they access the environment in terms of our needs, our context, and our intentions, rather than by the address. And it's a network that's laced together and automatically built. Sometimes it's equally important to know who you're near than it is to know your position. If I'm like Ben Weber's bank customers in Czechoslovakia, all I want to know is if I'm in front of you. I don't want to know the latitude and longitude of each of us. So I think these devices will gradually grow to build their own networks and their own communications by talking from one to the other. And so the choices we have will be provided by carriers, by Wi-Fi, by Bluetooth, and by the emergence of networks that are point-to-point and self-organized and work even when those fail. So I think the future is bright. I think the data is there. I think our understanding is there. I think our ability to detect it is there. And I think that our ability to build that into the spaces and commerce that we live with around us is likewise maturing. So that's where our future of mobility is, and I look forward to taking questions and arguing about it on the panel. Thank you.